Chapter 1. Wooden Voodoo. The following is an interview that I conducted with the former medical examiner from this case, namely the wooden voodoo doll and the boatman and his pleasure island, also known as Pinocchio. I look back at the original charges filed by Geppetto's union against the boatman. The only lead we had at first was Gideon the cat. We never could hold him for very long. Orders came in to follow Gideon the cat back and discover any leads as to his partner's whereabouts or to the location of the so-called boatman, who at the time was facing charges, kidnapping to unauthorized transmutation, and operating a salt mine without a license as well, an unregulated carnival attraction known Pleasure Island that had long gone bankrupt. The photos originally brought back by the first task force, F9E, aka the Cattails, show a slow and often passed out drunk Gideon. It took a week of careful cat and mouse work to discover the remains of the fox partner Lucky. Gideon had left his partner in the same spot, unmoved from where the miserable Vulpine hung himself in their tiny little shelter in an alleyway. This explained why Gideon spent more time on the street drunk. Turns out his home was the gruesome tomb of his only known associate and companion. We did, however, upon examining the remains, find chunks of the fox's flesh torn by what looked like cat's teeth. Gideon, the cat, never spoke a word during the raid, and never has to our knowledge said anything ever. The contents of Lucky pockets revealed correspondence, including a series of short letters that may have been exchanged between Lucky and someone who worked on the docks at Pleasure Island. The last letter seems never to have been sent, despite the dire and desperate tone Lucky takes addressing someone. We didn't get the name, but plenty of prejudice slurs towards an individual. An example from one of the correspondence written on a matchbook read something like this: "Jackass sail for Stromboli immediately, more stupid little boys on the way, soon be ready, ignorant donkeys." No motive has ever been established to determine Lucky's death as anything other than a suicide. We now had somewhere to look, and it was the docks, and within minutes of asking around, all signs and witnesses paid or otherwise had directed the Alligator, naval intel gathers, to a ship that Lucky and Gideon always were seen hanging around. The Redacted. The Redacted had indeed recently been moored there, and had been seen leaving with its decks jammed with young males age of 6 to 17, all rough-looking characters. Relief agents had to take over for the exhausted Cattails Task Force Omega-3 codenamed Kingfishers, and they would stake out in the dock, as well as send undercover informants, who appeared very young, and would likely fit the boatman's profile of rebellious, disobedient, and anarchistic things, got heated up very quickly. 3 days and 4 nights the Kingfishers had been monitoring the docks, but they themselves had also been monitored by Stromboli agents. The mad gypsy puppeteer had since captured that fairy that had been hiding with a Geppetto, and been forcing her to animate his various puppets, or so we thought at the time. It was these marionettes that had been hanging the various bait-monger stalls, had been reporting all of the cattails' movements, and now the Kingfishers. When the latter task force had gathered on the docks, the marionettes had set fire to the port and attempted to use the fog to take the task force out one by one. The Kingfishers were ready, as Stromboli actions had been brainstormed as a possibility by the top ciphers, who had insight into the Sicilian underground black market. In other words, the voodoo community sold Stromboli's secret out long ago, and that was why the Kingfishers were armed with the corresponding gear to counteract Stromboli's machinations. The former medical examiner went on to tell me one of the raids on the other side of the island had been roused, and our forces were brought to that false lead, thus dividing the Kingfishers' numbers. That decision almost ended with half of the task force dying to cutthroat voodoo dolls, who oddly enough continued to sing after being set fire or chainsaw as needed. One of the Kingfisher agents interviewed told me we lucked out that the Kingfishers had earned a favor with the mafia, and when the name of Stromboli had been mentioned, the 2 goons who more or less owned operations at that moor were happy to help. The task force was aided by 2 good fellas, who will remain unidentified, and will always remain so, as they sacrificed their lives to give the other half of the Kingfishers time to regroup, and also managed to track Stromboli to a nearby shack. The report of the raid became a best-selling book, but I have not read it because it contains details about the conditions of Stromboli hideaway. The mariner continued. I do happen to be a friend of the agent who put 2 rounds of lead into the despicable man's head before it tried to reanimate. The agent who took the shots told me these things that are not in the book about what came out of Stromboli's headless body. For my reader's sake, I have convinced that agent in question to allow me to disclose one of those details in this opening chapter as a sort of salute to the work the Kingfishers did. Stromboli's had detached of his own accord, he said. You can probably guess to the nature of that, but if you would rather not imagine it yourself, I'll give you something to go with. Stromboli was in the process of becoming a puppet himself. As a bonus, the agent showed me the scar on his wrist, where Stromboli had bitten him sometime after the raid was over. Even with 2 musket rounds in his skull, the cranium of the puppeteer of horror continued to curse and shout at agents. The Kingfisher continued to recall the operation. The containment ministry offered the head a sustained existence, somewhere underground, in exchange for the boatman's location. Stromboli's head did not reveal anything to us. The head was then placed into a birdcage tied to an anchor and tossed into the sea, hopefully to be swallowed by a whale. The Kingfisher expressed for a fitting end to Stromboli, for there were better leads. One of Stromboli's puppets had defected over to the mafia some weeks before the Cattails' arrival. Upon hearing of Stromboli's capture and the banishment to the bottom of the Mediterranean, the puppet, who we will call Paul, volunteered to help and had already been instrumental in the early intel gathering phase. Despite not knowing where to find the boatman, he promised the Justice Ministry that he would personally hang out at the docks and raise an alarm the minute the Redacted came to port. That was indeed the result, and we tracked the boatman's vessel, but not immediately to his island carnival trafficking ring. Instead, we followed the vessel to a salt mine. The Kingfishers were relieved and Task Force Alpha 5, better known as the Mariners, took over the hunt. One of their now retired agents told me it was during the pursuit that we got word that Geppetto was dead, and Pinocchio was the union by default, and would be the flesh and bone CEO of the Carpenter Woodworkers Union, and he would be the one to decide if we should pursue the boat. The day the response from Pinocchio would have arrived was the day that the ship had been spotted dropping anchor outside of this seemingly abandoned salt mine. We brought the heavy firepower ourselves, but a more subtle investigation group had been sent with us. This particular ministry has no designation, but is often just called the Shadow Squad. The surveillance that they carried out in that mine would convince anyone to become a vegetarian. The ex-mariner recalls seeing donkeys that had resorted to eating the dead of their own kind. There was no water being sent to the workers, or the donkeys who are wasting away. During the interview, I was told that suffering was something that you could hear and make out clearly among all of the sounds on the island with the mine had been left to rot. But this had not been Pleasure Island, and Pinocchio's message that had arrived that day had been clear: bring me the boatman's head. I asked the former mariner what he thought of that quote. We wanted to oblige Pinocchio now that he was the union representative of the most powerful of all the working trade guilds. He was strapped with prestige and as much gold as he could ever want to spend. But we are not a personal vengeance ministry. To give Pinocchio that closure would require us to stick some sort of heavy, hard-to-argue charges against the boatman. Currently, we only had animal endangerment, and had we had known that those jackasses had actually been boys originally. Once the boatman left the mine, the Shadow Squad exterminated every last donkey before blowing it all up. It would look cruel to anyone who had not seen the pictures of dead, rotted donkeys being suspiciously consumed by the other starving donkeys. It was undoubtedly mercy, the ex-mariner added. With the Mariners relieved by a fresh task force, their twin MK Alpha 5, but we just called the Nemesis, there was a break in protocols. I located one of Nemesis' agents and conducted a short interview. The Shadow Squad did not exchange fresh agents. They tend to only use 1 or 2 operators, but the situation required that they instead picked up 1 extra agent, so we had a total of 3, and it was that agent who managed to sneak aboard the Redacted and pose as either one of the crew. But we will never know because his cover was blown. The boatsman cut his throat and tossed him overboard. There was now nothing that could be done as far as any sort of defense that an attorney could possibly give that would convince the Nemesis to spare the boatman's life. Thing was, Nemesis knew that the boatman would be fortifying Pleasure Island. Knowing he was being followed, no other position or plan of attack or retreat was going to work, said the Nemesis agent. Indeed, the face of the boatman had been plastered on wanted signs all around the docks, and with the association between Stromboli and the boatsman, there was no way he would not be turned in upon landing. The boatsman's ship lead right into the harbor of Pleasure Island. It was not without some resistance that Nemesis took that place. At first, the agent continued, only a handful of the dark and nearly expressionless humanoid entities stay aligned with the boats. Man, his retreat to the island had resulted in a majority of the crew abandoned his vessel. The rest ended up murdered. We will never really know if it was out of fear or some sort of secret that he did not want them to reveal to us through some interrogation, he added. A good friend from the research ministry told me those crewmen were likely failed experiments in transmuting. Maybe a proto-attempt at making an inanimate object come alive. All we know is that upon perishing, those blurry bodies of the boatman's crew vanished into thin air. It wasn't the crew that gave Nemesis a hard time taking that harbor. The boatman was clever enough to lay countless booby traps. The twisted, unwholesome atmosphere of carnival mixed with prison and dark magic hung about silent as the small boats that brought the task force to Pleasure Island. What awaited them were pits with stakes at the bottom, some without spikes but with a much longer. Next was quicksand, in which the team spotted several botched attempts at transmuting inanimate flesh into living creatures. The agent from Nemesis told me who knows how long those things had been catatonically lying there, thus avoiding being sucked in, but when our agents passed by them, they animated and were instantly taking under. All it took was the slightest movement, and the tormented half-souls inside those broken, mutilated dolls went into a crushing blackness to live out the rest of their bindings in a dark and immovable tombstone of non-existence. Next was the flamethrowers and the poison darts, most of which had been guessed at by Paul, and so precautions have been taken. A massive wooden gate with spikes would have trapped the task force and finished them in one fell swing, but for Paul's warnings, the contraption was disarmed before it could even be set. Said the Nemesis agent, the scene was turning towards our victory, but taking a look around, the task force saw bodies of small boys who were now skeletons picked clean down to the marrow, and occasionally a dying donkey came out and had to be removed. Any living creature that was discovered had to be exterminated. The island's inhabitants had to be instantly liquidated. Mostly the harbor had been too easily taken. Perhaps the boatman was too desperate to care, and he could smell his own defeat as easily as the stench Pleasure is have been giving agents from within 10 kilometers. Said the agent, there is now a real rush to get the boatman's head back to Pinocchio as soon as possible. A series of walls and spiked defenses were easily climbed and disarmed. The stench of alchemy was now very fresh and pungent. One of the agents I interviewed from Nemesis told me that the boatman's alchemy attempts had been done after experiments with captured fairies, which had produced those blurry creatures. Overall, the smell was every bodily fluid excretion imaginable mixed with the metallic stain of blood, and then boosted to a whole nother level. It was a weapon into and of itself. He told me that the empty laboratory revealed that the boatman was not there. However, eventually, the miserable man was discovered hiding in a hole, that he had dug out below a secret entrance that tunneled somewhere below the island. His hiding place was good, so much so that we never would have known where to wait if the scenario hadn't gone nearly the exact same as Paul had informed them it would. He will hide anywhere and everywhere he can, the animated puppet told us. Expect him to have dug in for long operation. He will try to outwait you. The informant had even given us a rough topographical map of Pleasure Island, which Paul had marked with spots that would be the easiest to monitor and likely where the target would hide. As the arrest was about to happen, the boatman lost his cool, and his face went scarlet red. In a moment he managed to get off one shot from his tiny revolver that struck the agent attempting the arrest. The instant the trigger was pulled, the second Nemesis agent avenged his fallen friend and got a point-blank range shot off that took the boatman's neck off from his shoulders. The agent quickly grabbed the fallen Nemesis agent's gun and proceeded to shoot the man again. The heavy-set human trafficking tycoon was making desperate and angry gurgling noises as blood gushed away from the 2 bullet wounds. However, this would not do so. The second agent drew his short sword and hacked viciously at target. The man took way too long to die, the agent told me during the interview. His gurgling was seeming to give him recovered health with each breath. I then asked the agent if the boatman's condition was the same as Stromboli, but he assured me it was not. He did not go quiet into that night in the least bit. It did make for a very colorful report, though the boatman continued to show outward signs of being alive after being brutally dismembered for all of his wrongs and evils. It would seem that this man of death was accomplished alchemist, after all. The decision came as to what we wanted to do him, same with Stromboli, as we did with that miserable hunk of flesh, since it was a similar dismemberment that otherwise would have disallowed any sort of living. But our debates were cut short as the vivisected body parts showed signs of age reversal, and to everyone's shock, the parts reverted into that of a child, and in a sudden lurch, the body parts simultaneously began death rattles, as though whatever curse lifted so suddenly drained his life force, and the trapped body could no longer house a soul any longer. The boy who had been the boatman all at once understood that he had been taken apart, and in a great gasp of shock, his soul instantly departed the body. The scene did worsen, even after that, as the several pieces of the boatman's flesh made a last-ditch effort to survive by turning into a donkey. But this only hastened its defeat. The donkey thing stopped moving, and would only begin rotting after being left out on the deck of the deserted vessel for a week. If I had to guess, the trick was all in the will to survive. The archive expert from the alchemy division told me. Indeed, but at some point, even in a chemically sustained will can't survive forever. Chapter 2. Making good on our promise. We brought the lifeless and bleached skull of the boatman back to Pinocchio. We suspected that Pinocchio used the skull for some purposes, but that isn't really up to us. The task that Central would have been trying to identify all of the lost boys would have been forensically unlikely, as a great majority of the transmuted boys perished in the mine long before the Shadow Squad had even arrived. Because of the suffocating work that would bring a different approach was take to bring closure for the stubborn boys. The easiest route to take would be to find every family that reported a son missing. That, however, may be as far as that line of inquiry would go, because the nature of those multi-operations back and forth across the Mediterranean, the parents would have to be kept in the dark as to the fate of their sons. The intel guys had crafted their own mobilized disinformation unit, a crew of crisis actors who would approach the parents and pretend that they had known their son, that they had gone on a pilgrimage to Rome, or something from what he did not survive, but had valiantly saved their lives. These agents would, of course, be given all of the descriptions possible regarding the parents or siblings, and it would happen that more than one of these crisis actors would be adopted by the family because of the desperate hole left in the dishonest brother and son had left in the family dynamic. When this practice made its way towards the land east of the Rhine, some agents had abandoned their training and lead lives of excess and overindulgence. The crisis actor in that case was named Hansel, but we'll get to him on another book. There was considerable damage control to do in that the Sicilian harbor where the attack that happened against the agents, which required the intervention of those 2 mafia heroes. As for Pinocchio, by chance you happen to be unaware of the young corporate legacy and his spiral downward, the botched mafia alliance. Combined with greed and ambition from within Pinocchio's cabinet, the former marionette boy was assassinated by his driver. Our archive is, at the time, told me, I'm the first person to jump on a conspiracy, even if it's only to entertain it as means of discrediting it. However, this case Pinocchio obviously had not learned his lesson about telling lies, and eventually, those lies made him stand out. That combined with poking his nose, where it should not have been in that respect, I find Pinocchio vengeance against the boatman. Misplaced as evil as Boatman was in the end, it was his decisions, and Pine Boy made it desperate, clearly having that consciousness, cricket luxury, that he no longer gets to enjoy. As an addition to this story, I have recounted there has been a second edition, and I have been given an update to this case. The only unaccounted subversive was Jiminy Cricket, who had gone missing upon Pinocchio's transmutation into flesh blood, and the desperate Pinocchio's tireless and well-funded search could not find any sign of the cricket. If indeed he had even been killed during all of those skirmishes which the official story had said to tidy things up. But an attached picture with the update shows a wooden Jiminy Cricket of titanic proportions, and dangling on puppet strings below him are humans who have been impaled with hooks and being made to violently attack each other. All around the scene are shattered and torn bits of various human limbs. I read on the enclosed letter from Gideon the cat, which had been written in a crude imitation of Lucky, the fox's handwritten correspondence with the dockworker at Pleasure Island. The simplistic prose, and all the errors have been edited for sake of the story. It seems appropriate not to shortchange the crickets chapter, and despite Gideon's early misgivings, he had proven very useful, if not instrumental, so I had to read it and then reproduce it properly. You got the wrong guy, you fools. Did you really think the boatman was the chief of such a complex human trafficking operation? I was fooled too, but now I've learned from Lucky's letters and I will tell you what pieces you missed that might have resulted in Jiminy Cricket defeat. It's a little late to destroy Cricket by stepping on him or eating him. He's grown very large and requires more blood every day, but let me try to not get ahead of myself here. You see, I'm learning. This is still not easy, but getting better. More that I write on, understand that Cricket is by no means an insect, that's just a shell he picked up along the way, and if you do not act quickly, it won't be his last. He believes himself to be the chief deity of the fairies, the crown prince of rose thorns, the reincarnation of Kek or Osiris. He calls himself all that and more, much more. For a side note, the reader should take into account that by this point, the letter was almost incomprehensible and had become full of names of ancient gods that the Cricket had fooled himself into believing he was their spirit that was not going to be perishing anytime soon. All that madness I just described should be in the foreground of everything that you read, for I will continue to recount his letter presently. His madness has not reached into my head as emptied as mine is. It did not find it suitable for his needs, and if he did, he has not taken it for his own. It is possible his thirst for blood is unquenchable, and he could be willing to make a deal with humans, leaders, that he is supreme, and all fear-consuming, who lives forever. The true consciousness, the very first clue to the whole case, made itself known only by its absence. Lucky and myself had found Stromboli washed up in vengeful against Pinocchio. Who was the link between Geppetto's death and his son's squandering of his wealth? But even the dark side of the magic world has its outer limits, the flesh to be overcome, not with metal, but with wood, the way Lucky told it to Stromboli. You'd think that flesh was the pinnacle of sin and evil. This was not Lucky anymore. Cricket abilities of mind projection had tripled in power. He was now in command of the boatman, Lucky, and then Stromboli. Now with his skin replaced with that, a black pine wood, the spirit of Jiminy Cricket is feverishly thirsty to sustain every second of his prolonged existence in this transformation. This is his torment, and his apotheosis, the bug god. He who can no longer be trotted under heel, the lord of flies. He cannot be consumed by any bird or fairy. The account continues to use bug monitors for another page in style, not in like that of a crazy cultist messiah complex, typical of overbearing megalomaniacs, so I have skipped to the better parts that require less contextual explanation. If he is to be stopped by anyone, it has to be the fairy. Her abilities, they have been her very existence. In other words, she's animated or was forced to animate the dolls till she could no longer exist. Lucky knew, and myself I might have known, but I no longer do. We are her offspring. Her light dawned within the emptiness of my existence when Jiminy Cricket cracked my head open to find nothing, but he left me there to be catatonic. But with the fae being the closer kin to creatures than humans, a small piece of the fairy who first brought Pinocchio to life, and it is her vital force. My body had. Now it is important that I am discovered and burnt as quickly as possible. An address was given. It was Geppetto's old workshop, the birthplace of Pinocchio, and nothing could have been more out in the open trap. Even if Cricket was behind the human trafficking operation, it was worth looking into, and once again, Task Force Cattails was deployed to Italy's neighboring island. The old shack had been destroyed by Pinocchio, and had built a memorial which was a giant statue in his father's likeness. A cold marble statue whose photo in the case file requires 2 pages to show properly. Another digression, if you'll permit me. The statue of Pinocchio made of himself in the Union headquarters directly after his father's was built so big that the photograph could not be taken and requires a balloonist to accomplish. Sometimes they do fun stuff up there in the information ministry, a dangerous but rewarding job. Careful surveillance had proven Gideon's claims about the boatman's fate being a little consequence. It was not only the boys who were going missing, but now there are little girls as well. The mafia don had passed away, leaving Paul and his ambitions as a living kind of Pinocchio, but with no desire to become real at all, to move in and become the new figurehead of organized crime. When asked, Paul could only direct us to the specific parents of the missing children, although we theorized that Paul had become too close to the family, and indeed, it was likely that Paul had hired Pinocchio's driver to take the shot so that he could plot his way up to the top. This would mean that Paul the puppet had succeeded in gaining another portion of the realm's government in the name of crime. A cattail liaison told me during an interview we had to disregard the intel Paul was given to us a week before the old Don's death, but it was worth it because nothing the Pine Boy would tell us was even half true. That's what tipped us off about the corrupted state of things, like a rotted chunk of wood. There was, after all, no real giant cricket made of wood, and we had Gideon locked up, so whoever wrote that wanted us to show up there unawares. We determined that because whoever this was did not know, we captured Gideon, or knew, and was using the deception to tell us something. But why would you write such an elaborate fabrication? Cattail's agents picked back up, nearly from where they had left off following the cat around, so they fell back into rhythm very quickly. The breakthrough discovery was a coffin-sized statue of Jiminy Cricket that had been discovered underneath Geppetto's statue. When the unit was open, they found it contained a human body that would be the identical version of Paul, the current version. He appeared to be, at least at that time by my reckoning, the cattail agent continued. There was way more bones below, in similar coffins, all Paul lookalikes. The order came to have those all exhumed, and the statue moved elsewhere. All of the bodies were clones, all genetic matches. Shockingly enough, it seemed as though this wooden dummy had been reverse transmuting bodies. It was a trap, of course, so we walked right into it. But having foreknowledge of the release of switches and various wooden cricket coffins discovered prior resulted in whatever diabolical plan Paul was trying being cut short. Paul then, having since abandoned his short-lived empire, to whichever family wants it more, and his only written note are a series of strange one-liners appropriate to the case. Liar, liar, you're all on fire. You have no leads on me. They're all jackasses. Always let a disembodied voice be your guide. Epilogue. A letter from the editor. Okay.
Okay, first off, I'm going to strangle you, but I'll save that for later. This manuscript could only be read by chickens on benzodine, and forget about consistency with the plot lines. I mean, who wants to even craft a plot these days when I can write it for you, and even if the quality is low, it is still valued for some reason. But looking past the factual, textual, and literal errors, this demands an insight, and that is that you should do things like this more regularly, and you have no need for work ever again. But let me suggest some ideas in case you don't have any of your own in your head already. Consider Sleeping Beauty. Her villain Maleficent, the mistress of all evil, was slain by a mortal prince. How can that complicate politics right between him and his new bride Aurora, or better yet Ursula, another dark-disposed queen slain by a shiny white-clad prince? Bet the legal documents involved in that lawsuit by Ursula's two sisters made that headache. I'm sure he deals with it even to this day. And I'm not saying let's find the guy who shot Bambi's mom, cause we all know that was deer season. But consider the case of Peter Pan and Captain Hook. They are both kidnapping psychos in the end, but Captain Hook may not have deserved to be left to the crocodile to be eaten alive. How about the psychological torment Waddy gives Sid in the first Toy Story? Sure, Sid destroys toys, but then again, who doesn't? You can note that Belle was suffering from Stockholm Syndrome, and that Gaston's attempted liberation of her should not have been ended with gas being tossed off the castle. We know she loved the beast, and it would not have taken a tragedy to break that curse. If things had not gone differently the way I see it, Belle could have just married Gaston and waited to inherit his wealth, and maybe had 1 or 2 kids, maybe even have some of those dogs that she seemed to want more than the kids. She could divorce. Divorce was a thing in France. I'm sure if not, Belle had enough courage to wait until Guest's back was turned, and then she would kill him. I digress, though. Don't need to write the whole book for you, but for real, son, keep on this, and you'll be working so much it hurts. Not bad at all. Yes, it'll help motivate you. Pain is a fantastic motivator. So get cracking. Do not skip on the gore or the humor or the politics or the spy thriller meets Disney meets Lovecraft. P.S. If Mickey Mouse is now in the free domain, be patient. Disney characters may yet become the same in the future. Special thanks.
Grimm Realm, Staging and Lighting. The Grimm Wardrobe and Costume LLC. The Government of Sicily and the Sicilian Department of Defense. The Vatican, let's just leave it for now. The Volunteer Sailors Union based in Roman Venice. The estate of Baron Samedi. The First Church of Calypso. No particular thanks. Weather in winter along Sicily. Riders Union strike. The nature of wood in the sun after being soaked in water. Devalued American currency to euros.